What if everything you thought you knew about the Fulani Jihad was only half the truth? What if this famous 1804 uprising, often described simply as a religious conflict, was actually the explosion of decades of political tension, social injustice, and ethnic discrimination? What if the real spark that ignited one of the most transformative revolutions in African history wasn't a holy command, but a government crackdown? This is the story hidden beneath the surface. The story that most textbooks simplify. The story of the forces that built up, boiled over, and finally detonated into the Fulani Jihad, movement that reshaped West Africa and still influences Nigeria today. To understand what truly sparked this revolution, we have to go back in time, long before 1804, to a world where power, culture, and injustice clashed in the Hausa kingdoms. The Hausa city-states Kano, Katsina, Gobir, and others were some of the most important commercial and cultural hubs in precolonial Africa. Their markets were vibrant, their rulers commanded armies, and their cities attracted scholars and traders from across the Sahara. Yet beneath that brilliance, things were falling apart. By the late 1700s, these kingdoms were drowning in corruption. Rulers imposed crushing taxes on peasants, merchants, and pastoralists. Some engaged in unfair trade practices, while others sold their own people into slavery to fund court luxuries. Political succession became chaotic, with kings overthrowing each other or clinging to power through violence. Ordinary people felt the weight of this oppression daily. But no group felt it more deeply than the Fulani communities. The Fulani were spread across the region, herding cattle and trading dairy products. Though many had lived there for generations, they were often treated as outsiders. They were taxed unfairly, harassed by local officials, and sometimes displaced from their grazing routes by political elites. On top of that, they couldn't always practice their Islamic faith freely, as local rulers tried to limit any religious influence that could challenge their authority. Into this tense world stepped a man who would change everything, Usman dan Fodio. To his followers, he was a scholar, a spiritual guide, and a reformer inspired by justice. To the ruling elites, he was a threat, an educated, charismatic leader whose influence was spreading too far, too fast. Born in 1754 in the kingdom of Gobir, Dan Fodio was immersed in scholarship from a young age. He studied law, theology, and history. But he didn't just study, he challenged the status quo. He pointed out injustices and called for societal reform. As his fame spread, people from all walks of life began to gather around him, not just Fulani, but also Hausa farmers, women seeking empowerment, slaves seeking hope, and merchants tired of corruption. With admiration, however, came fear from those in power. By the 1780s, Usman dan Fodio had become more than just a teacher. He was a voice for the oppressed. He criticized rulers for imposing unjust taxes, exploiting the poor, violating Islamic principles, and selling people into slavery. This made him extremely popular among the people, and extremely dangerous to the rulers of Gobir. For a while, they tolerated him. But as his influence grew, their patience ran out. The tension intensified when Sarkin Nafata, the ruler of Gobir, tried to limit Dan Fodio's influence by banning certain forms of preaching. But Nafata also recognized Dan Fodio's popularity and tried to negotiate rather than escalate. Things changed when Nafata died, and his successor, Yunfa, took a very different approach. Yunfa had once been Dan Fodio's student, but now he feared the scholar's growing power. He feared a popular uprising that could challenge the monarchy. So he decided to act not with debate, but with force. Between 1802 and 1804, Yunfa began a systematic crackdown on Dan Fodio and his community. He banned public preaching, restricted the freedom of his followers, and seized their cattle and property. He issued edicts to limit their movement and pressured other Hausa rulers to act against them. Then came the breaking point. Yunfa attempted to assassinate Usman dan Fodio. This was the match thrown into a field of dry grass. The assassination attempt failed, but the message was clear. The reform movement was no longer just a religious inconvenience. It was now an existential threat to the ruling class. In response, Dan Fodio fled with his followers to a place called Guju. Soon, people began pouring in from all over: Fulani pastoralists escaping harassment, Hausa peasants escaping taxes, and scholars escaping political oppression. Thousands gathered, and for the first time, Dan Fodio was declared Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful. At that moment, the conflict shifted from persecution to revolution. The Fulani Jihad had begun, but to call it a religious jihad alone is to miss the deeper truth. This was also a rebellion against corrupt kings, a revolt against injustice, a cry for social reform, a movement for freedom of worship, a reaction to discrimination, and a battle for political liberation. Religion was the banner that unified the movement, but injustice was the fuel that drove it. As Dan Fodio tightened his leadership, the movement grew with unprecedented momentum. Clans, families, and even entire communities joined in. The jihad spread across Hausaland, sweeping through cities and toppling kingdoms one after another. Gobir fell. Kano fell. Katsina fell. By 1810, the Hausa political structure had been completely rearranged. In its place, the mighty Sokoto Caliphate emerged, becoming one of the largest and most influential empires in African history. Under the new leadership, significant reforms were introduced. They established a more structured system of taxation, implemented anti-corruption policies, and expanded Islamic education. Judicial reforms were based on Islamic law, markets were regulated, and oppressive policies were reduced. The caliphate wasn't perfect, but it was far more organized than the fragmented kingdoms it replaced. For over a century, the Sokoto Caliphate shaped the political and social landscape of what is now northern Nigeria. Even when British colonialism arrived in the early 1900s, the colonial administrators retained the emirate structure created by Dan Fodio's movement, a testament to its enduring power. This history remains deeply relevant today. When people talk about northern Nigeria, about ethnic identity, political power, or social reform, the shadows of the Fulani Jihad still linger. To truly understand modern Nigeria, one must understand this turning point. Not just the battles, not just the religious claims, but the human struggles, the injustice, and the hope that made it all possible. The Fulani Jihad teaches us that revolutions don't start overnight. They build slowly, silently, in the hearts of people who have been pushed too far. It teaches us that when leaders abuse power, people resist. When corruption becomes unbearable, societies rise up. When voices of reform are silenced, they only grow louder. What sparked the Fulani Jihad was not just religion, it was the collision of oppression and resistance. Injustice forced people to pick a side. Power forced people to choose their future. Desperation forced people to fight. And so, the Fulani Jihad stands not simply as a holy war, but as a revolutionary struggle for justice and dignity, led by a man whose courage changed the destiny of a region. Today, as we reflect on this crucial moment in African history, we are reminded that every society must confront its injustices or one day face the spark that ignites change. The story of the Fulani Jihad is not just a story of the past. It is a warning, a lesson, and a reflection on the power of ordinary people to reshape their world. Because history is not made by kings alone. History is made by those who dare to challenge them. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more hidden histories. See you next time.